We will begin our event now. So on behalf of the Jamhoor team, I would like to welcome everyone who has joined us today to the Toronto book launch of Brewing Resistance, Indian Coffee House and the Emergency in Post Colonial India with the author, Dr. Kristin Plys. And I'm Sabika and I'm a member of Jamhoor and I will be your moderator for today's event. So Jamhoor is a critical media platform for writers, artists, activists, and academics from South Asia and its diasporas. And we publish and hold events on the critical leftist content in addition to hosting our podcast, Jamhoor Radio. So some of our recent issues have covered topics on the themes of left politics in South Asia, right-wing authoritarianism in South Asia, the politics of the diasporas, and our most recent issue this summer was on the climate change in South Asia. So as a volunteer-based organization, we count on the support of our readership. So to continue paying our content writers from South Asia and to expand this really exciting work that we want to be, we want to continue, we require your help. So as I speak, my colleague Arsalan will be dropping a link to Jamhoor's website where you can read more about our content, and Jamhoor's Patreon link where you can sign up to support Jamhoor in whatever small or large amounts that is possible. So as a team, we are really looking forward to today's discussion on how we can take lessons from the Indian emergency, which in spite of being an extremely violent period of history is not very often discussed amongst our circles. Collectively we may connect this history with the ongoing struggles in India right now. And we hope that this event will provide an accessible introduction to the events of the emergency and that we're able to draw parallels between the current authoritarian turn in Indian politics, and where once again we are seeing that student politics and organized labor has come to the forefront. So a little about our panelists today. Leading our discussion are Dr. Kristin Plys and Priyansh. And Dr. Kristin Plys is an assistant professor of sociology at the University of Toronto, Mississauga. Her research and writing focus on political economy, sociology of development, labor and labor movements in India, Pakistan, and the larger South Asian context. Kristin is currently leading a very exciting project on anti-authoritarian paintings and poetry, which are rooted in Lahore's cafe culture. And she's also currently working on her book, Capitalism and Its Uncertain Future, which is due to come out next year. Congratulations, Kristin. And thank you so much for coming to talk with us today. Then we have Priyansh. Priyansh is a PhD student in physical culture studies at the University of Toronto. His research explores the relationship between games, exercise regimes, and the Hindu nationalist party with a focus on masculinities and the aesthetics of bodily performance. He also works as a freelance writer and was previously a sports correspondent for the Hindu. I will now request Priyansh to lead the discussion section of our event. And after this discussion section, we will be moving on to our 45 minutes Q&A section. So off to you, Priyansh.
Thank you so much, Sabika, for that kind introduction. And it's really great to see so many people today for an event that we've been really looking forward to. First of all, I would like to thank Kristin, for taking out the time to have this discussion today. But also, I would like to offer my gratitude to everyone who's joined us from wherever in the world that you're joining. Usually, if we were to do a book launch, it would be only those who are in Toronto would be able to attend. But obviously, we live in these very different times, and there are also new possibilities now. Really, one of the reasons why we were so keen to take up this book, and it was a fairly straightforward decision for Jamhoor to do an event around brewing resistance, is because I think all of us as members of Jamhoor share the feeling that there is a need for a Marxist or a leftist perspective on events that fundamentally are of fundamental importance and really dramatically altered the direction that many of the South Asian countries have taken, in this case India. And we couldn't really think of anyone better than Kristin to discuss the emergency. So first of all, congratulations, Kristin, for the book that came out earlier this year. And really, to begin the conversation, I can't think of a more sort of simpler point. What made you choose the emergency, and why did you choose to write about it? And it'd be great if you could also, give us a sort of brief overview of the book for those who haven't had a chance to read it yet.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Savika and Priyansh, for that introduction. And thank you to Jamhoor for organizing the launch. And I think that I just want to start by saying that Jamhoor has done such important work in the GTA and beyond and created a really exciting intellectual community, and is such an important incubator for left politics. And I think that that should be commended and supported. And so just to echo, the earlier comments that everyone who can should seriously consider donating to support events like this, along with the website and podcast. And it's such a great resource for left politics and strategy in South Asia and beyond. So to answer your initial question, Priyansh, I began working on this book in 2011 after I had written a dissertation proposal for a very different book. And I had an activist background before going to grad school, and I wanted the dissertation research to tell an optimistic story about workers' agency in the global South and to build a theory of emancipatory, anti-capitalist, and anti-imperialist struggles. So the initial plan was to do comparative work on worker cooperatives in Argentina and Uruguay after the 2001 financial crisis, compared to worker cooperatives in Tunisia and Egypt during the Arab revolutions of 2011, which had just started as I was writing my prospectus. And I was really keen to do this research in North Africa, since that's where my mother's family immigrated to the US from. But I had defended this proposal, and the revolutions in North Africa were intensifying. And so it made it really difficult to go there to do research. And at the same time that that door closed, then Yale, where I did my PhD, launched this exchange program with JNU in New Delhi, which I'm sure many of you are very familiar with. And I had an opportunity to apply for that exchange. And because JNU is this such exciting space for left politics, the idea of spending a was really intriguing to me, even though I didn't really have any specific area interest in South Asia at that time. And so most of the preliminary research and readings I had done, along with the language skills I had spent years acquiring, were geared to understanding workers' movements and anti-colonial struggles in Africa and Latin America. And so there was this learning curve, but I do think that that background brings this global perspective to the work that, maybe we can link up and talk about a little bit more. But when, I knew that I was going to go to JNU, I began reading up on the cooperative and labor movement in India, and was still intent on writing a dissertation about anti-colonial labor movements in the global South, now in India, that would recover optimistic stories to inspire a global anti-colonial left. And in preparing for that year at JNU, which actually ended up being a little bit longer than a year, I became particularly interested in Indian Coffee House, since it's the largest workers cooperative in India. But it was also occupied and appropriated by its Communist Party affiliated workers in 1946 during India's freedom movement, as this intervention against colonialism and capitalism. And so it seemed to me to be the uplifting anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist story I wanted to tell, and use to build Marxist-Leninist Maoist theory. So as I started doing archival work around Delhi, I came to learn of the Indian Coffee House's importance during the emergency, because that wasn't really in any of the written sources that I had access to at the time. And I think that over the course of my research, I only found 2 sources that even mentioned the Indian Coffee House's role in the emergency, and it was just sort of a sentence here or there. So I realized that recovering that part of the coffee house's history was probably the more important story to recover, because there was some things that we knew about the workers' movement in the 1940s, but what happened during the emergency seemed to be the really important story to recover, since none of this history was really written down. But I was initially reluctant, I think, to pivot from this story of the workers' movement in the 1940s to the movement against authoritarianism in the 1970s, because it just didn't seem the best fit with my politics at the time, because I was really concerned of the class politics of shifting from focusing on workers' movements to then focusing on intellectuals and artists. And then because of, again, most of my political activism was in anarchist or Maoist movements, depending on which country I was living in, I also had some doubts about whether what we on the left would call like a bourgeois democracy, and whether that's something worth defending. So the idea of writing a dissertation about the defense of bourgeois democracy was something that gave me pause. But from an academic perspective, you know, it was undeniable that this story of Indian coffee house during the emergency, because it was lesser known and a bit more complicated, was much more interesting than the workers' movement in the 40s. And so I tried to see this as a challenge to theorize like the occlusion of bourgeois democracy from a Marxist-Leninist, Maoist, and world systems perspective. And as I got deeper into it, this history of the emergency, along with the conversations that I had with the communist, socialist, and Maoist intellectuals that I did oral histories with, really changed my mind about the relationship between bourgeois politics of the state and more revolutionary politics. So I've learned over the course of doing this research, and I also think that the world has changed very significantly since I started this project in 2011. So the research has at least convinced me, along with sort of recent historical developments, that bourgeois democracy is definitely preferable to authoritarianism. And I think that, again, like the last decade has shown across the globe that there's this real qualitative difference to everyday life under authoritarian rule. And organizing revolutionary politics becomes far more difficult under an authoritarian state compared to a bourgeois democratic state. So that's, I guess, a brief overview of how the book came about. And so now perhaps I can talk a little bit more about what I see as the political contributions to the book, since this is sort of, you know, this is a political discussion, not an academic one. And so I think that, you know, for those of us in the audience who are, you know, straddling academic and political concerns, there are some pragmatic concerns that have to be navigated. And so, like, I will say that part of that for me as sort of like a pre-tenure faculty member is to publish a book that engages disciplinary debates and is published by an academic press. But my personal metric of success of what I want for the book is that people who are involved in left politics pick it up and read it and think it has something important to offer in terms of recovering left history and helping left movements across the globe better strategize for resistance against authoritarian rule. So for reasons related to this, it was also important for me that the book be accessible in India. And I was really lucky to be able to work with Qudsiya Ahmed at Cambridge, who, you know, like, not only were we very much on the same page, no pun intended, with our vision for the book, but she really allowed me and encouraged me even to play up like left theory building and political praxis. So that made it really easy to make this political contribution with the book and then do what I need to do with the professional concern. So, because I do think it's difficult to navigate like a creative and political vision with, you know, what, you know, one has to do for the academic career. So that being said, like, I want to talk a little bit more about what I see the book doing beyond, you know, contributing to academic knowledge. And so there are three things that I see the book doing as a work of theory and praxis, and that is building Marxist-Leninist Maoist theory, recovering left history, particularly of the anti-colonial workers movement in the 1940s and the movement against the emergency in the 1970s. And then finally, like, using this theory that's been developed to analyze this left history in order to draw lessons for left praxis. And so to talk a little bit about the theory that the book puts forth, I've constructed this theory of the role of anti-colonial labor movements during the post-colonial authoritarian moment of the 1970s Global South. And the argument is that during the colonial period, labor and left movements push not just for national independence, but also for a reconfiguring of social relations in order to redress the hierarchies that are either introduced or reinforced by colonial rule. And so the radical social justice aims of national liberation then, like, are encapsulated in these anti-colonial labor movements that push back both against colonialism and the capitalist relations of production that colonialism introduces and intensifies. So then after independence, the real challenge begins, and the class structure largely remains the same. And the same revolutionary left and labor-oriented anti-colonial movements continue to push for these radical aims of national liberation. And post-colonial states initially try to quell this social unrest and redirect it through this ideology of economic development. And so in other words, these new ruling class these new ruling classes make claims that for the good of the nation, the radical aims of national liberation are secondary to the newly independent state's economic success in the world arena. And so the anti-colonial working class, in my theorizing, initially accepts economic development as a worthy objective, but over time, there's this disaffection, and the anti-colonial working class then becomes increasingly militant in the struggle to fully decolonize, and offers alternative ideologies of development that would really realize these radical social objectives. So one key form then I contend that the post-colonial class struggle takes is articulated through these competing ideologies of economic development. But in situations where post-colonial movements to fully decolonize become more militant and oppositional, we see, and this is like large swaths of the global South then fall into this by the 1970s, that post-colonial states abandon this project of liberal economic development and instead resort to authoritarian rule in order to protect the status quo. And so in this moment of state repression that again was like proliferated throughout the global South in the 1970s, this repertoire of contentious politics become limited. But the argument in the book is that there's these certain autonomous spaces that preserve the spirit of national liberation, which then animates movements against the post-colonial authoritarian state. So that's what the book is doing in terms of left theory. And so the history piece is that it recovers the history of the resistance movement against the emergency, which has been largely forgotten. And the few that do remember it have this kind of distorted history of the emergency that's used for political purposes. And I'm sure we'll get into that in discussion about a lot of the myths that are circulating about what actually happened in India in the late 70s. But the emergency was declared in June of 1975. And this was after the Allahabad High Court found Indira Gandhi guilty of corrupt election practices and barred her from holding office for 6 years. And so instead of conceding to these rulings, Gandhi declared a state of emergency and installed herself as the sole political authority in India. So during the emergency, political meetings, rallies, agitations were banned. State agents arrested and detained people without trial. Academic freedom and the free press were eliminated. Students, intellectuals, journalists were subject to surveillance, were abducted by secret police and condemned without trial for dissenting views. Police shot and killed protesters without any repercussion. Peasants were targeted and rounded up and taken to family planning camps where they were forcibly sterilized. And in cities, entire slums were bulldozed, which left the most vulnerable urbanites without food, sanitation, water, shelter, access to healthcare. And these measures also disproportionately targeted Muslims and Dalits, and they were carried out under the explicit rubrics of development and progress. So we really forget how violent the emergency truly was. So many were forcibly sterilized and left to die because of inadequate aftercare. Countless federal government, state and city officials repeated in government reports and in the oral histories I conducted, this came up again and again, that the prevailing wisdom during the emergency was that Muslims in particular had to be taught a lesson. And we saw that countless intellectuals, students, and political workers were tortured in jails. So I think we'll probably get a little bit more into the details, but I'll just leave it at that for now in terms of what the emergency really was about. And so finally, when we combine theory and history together, I think we get praxis, at least that's how it happens in my thinking. And so the book levies this theory of anti-colonial labor movements during the post-colonial authoritarian moment to analyze this history of repression, to draw lessons that can help us build better left praxis. And I also think we're probably going to get into a lot of the details of what these lessons are. But I'll end this overview for now by just saying that this experience of state repression, in individuals evokes these feelings of isolation and loneliness because it prevents people from connecting, but that's also really essential in preparing people for authoritarian domination. But gathering and discussing political strategy in the context of the Indian coffee house helped those who were involved in contentious politics to overcome these feelings of loneliness. I mean, everybody was brought together and realized, this is not an individual thing, it's a social thing. And that's something that Albert Camus tells us, that when suffering ceases to be seen as this individual experience, but instead is viewed as a collective experience, this evidence lures us from our solitude. And this was, I think, one of the more foundational things that the Indian Coffee House did, in the words of many of those I spoke with over the course of my research. It brought people with a proclivity to oppositional politics together in this one space, and really helped anyone who went there to realize that the loneliness of the emergency was a shared experience. And those who visited the Indian Coffee House during the emergency and had felt this really palpable change to everyday life in Delhi describe these feelings of loneliness and isolation in a way that then allowed the activists at the forefront of this movement against the emergency to overcome these feelings and create this solid foundation that then made collective action against the state possible. So I think I'll stop here and kick it back over to Priyansh, and maybe we can have a bit more of a dialogue about.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Kristin. And thanks for laying out the aims and objectives, and all the work that went into the book. Almost accidental, but it tells a story about research and how work usually pans out. It's not always how we intend it to be. But just to take up some things that you were saying towards the end about isolation, loneliness, solitude. These are sentiments or feelings which are not really alien. I mean, we're living through another kind of emergency, which is a health emergency these days. But I'm thinking politically, in India, as you know it as well as anyone else, that generally opposition parties now, when they're responding to the right-wing BJP, which is in power, they always use this term of undeclared emergency. And it's a really popular term which has caught on, especially since 2014, since Modi came to power. So I'm just wondering what is it about the emergency that it has such strength and such potency, that that nobody wants to be associated with it, and like you hinted at, it was a violent event. There's a human cost to it, and if you could reflect on that for us, what is it about the undeclared emergency, and what parallels maybe that you see now?
Yeah, no, I think that that's a really good point, that it's been levied in so many different ways in the contemporary moment to describe a range of things that may or may not correspond to what actually happened in the moment of the emergency. And I think that, the reticence, particularly for those who have lived through the emergency and are now involved in politics in the contemporary period, is that, again, we forget the extent of violence that was perpetrated in this political moment of the 1970s. And so in one of the oral histories I did, one of the socialist movement leaders told me that, the best way to think about emergency is that it's a euphemism for totally violent dictatorship. And I think that that's a pretty good metric, and nobody wants to be associated with, perpetuating a totally violent dictatorship. And so I think that, again, we forget how violent the emergency was. And these discussions of an undeclared emergency, I think, sometimes minimize the brutality of the emergency. So I think that on the centrist liberal position, or the Congress position, to call it an undeclared emergency is, forgets that the emergency was, or has this implication that the emergency was largely about enacting political revenge on Indira Gandhi's opponents through this erasure of a soft right. But the emergency was, again, this totally violent dictatorship. And if we think about the center-right political scientist Samuel Huntington's analysis of the emergency, he saw it as one of just 11 instances in modern political history that fit the definition of totalitarianism, which is the most repressive form of dictatorship. So again, I think that there is this minimizing of the emergency as enacting political revenge on opponents, and this erasure of soft rights, but not really affecting everyday life. But I think that that's totally inaccurate. So I'll give a couple more examples of the violence of the emergency, because I think it's important that we dispel some of these myths and also remember some of the history that's been forgotten. And so some of the audience might be familiar with this, but for many, the emergency is still referred to colloquially as a Naqshbandi ki Waqt, which is sort of like the time of sterilizations. And so I think it would be good to start by talking a bit about the forced sterilizations that took place during the emergency. So if we think about like one instance of how this took place, we can look at Muzaffarnagar in Uttar Pradesh, which I think we all know as the location of communal violence in 2013, and the setting of the controversial film Muzaffarnagar Baki Hai. And so this was like also the scene of a particularly violent episode of state violence during the emergency. And so after the emergency was declared in June 75, sterilization camps were opened across North India. And in Uttar Pradesh alone, the sterilization program averaged about 340 vasectomies per day in June, which then ratcheted up to 1,600 per day in July, and almost 5,700 per day in August of 75. And so the police in UP were ordered by different district officials to round up peasants for forced sterilization in order to help officials meet the targets that were being set by Indira Gandhi's son, Sanjay Gandhi, who is like extremely passionate about the sterilization drives. So in Muzaffarnagar, a mob started throwing stones at this family planning camp, outraged that particularly unmarried young people who hadn't had children were being forcibly sterilized alongside, people of all ages. And so in suppressing this uprising against the family planning camp in Muzaffarnagar, police killed 25 Muslim peasants, and then also entered a mosque near the family planning camp where they shot and killed an additional 3 people inside the mosque, and then threw all of the victims of these police shootings into a nearby river to conceal the fatalities. And so I think that this example shows that most of those who were forcibly sterilized during the emergency were Muslims and Dalits. And in this confidential memo that was written to Indira Gandhi, and which I uncovered in the course of my archival research, and it looks like no one had checked it out, because usually you have to sign in the back of the file, and there wasn't any signature. So I was shocked that no one was looking at these documents. But one of Gandhi's advisors describes to her in great detail that particularly in UP, that there were a lot of impoverished Muslim and Dalit peasants who were forced into getting vasectomies by a range of government workers. And again, because of this poor aftercare that was given, the memo details how many developed sepsis or tetanus after the vasectomy operations, and then died as a result of this. And so the tenor of the memo was also kind of intriguing because and really disturbing, because the concern on behalf of Indira Gandhi and her cabinet was that Muslim and Dalit peasants would notice that there was this growing instance of death after forced vasectomy, and they were worried that it would create sort of a resistance movement of Muslim peasants against the emergency, and really concerned that religious leaders in UP would support that resistance. Or, should elections be resumed at some point, that this, human toll of the forced sterilization drive would lead to support for opposition parties over Congress. So the report, I think, ultimately shows that Gandhi was not only aware of this human toll that forced sterilization was taking, but also that it really disproportionately targeted like poor rural Muslims and Dalits. And, she did nothing to intervene, because this continued like after the report was circulated. And it was a private report just meant to be among her and her advisors. So I think that this brings us to another important point that's worth making about the violence of the emergency, that there's this popular misconception that there was no communal aspect to the emergency, but countless documents, reports, and inquiry commissions, and in the oral histories I did, this similar phase kept coming up, which was either like Muslims had to be taught a lesson, or this was done with a view to teach the Muslims. And when we start to get into like, what was this lesson, or what had to be taught, especially from the perspective of the emergency state, I think it brings us to some pretty dark places. And one well-known example of this, I think, is the Turkmen Gate Uprising, which was one of the more violent episodes of the emergency, but also, I think, something to be recovered and celebrated as, people defending themselves in their neighborhood from state violence. And so it's fairly well known that the family planning camp that was operating in Turkmen Gate was overseen by Sanjay Gandhi's friend and the famous socialite Rukhsana Sultana. And Sultana arranged police escorts for men going to and from the camp and enlisted police officers to recruit men for vasectomy. And so many of these men later, tried to seek redress for what was the atrocities that were committed against them during the emergency, and told different government inquiry commissions that because the police were, actively recruiting people, that they felt they had no choice but to undergo vasectomy. And so it was also came out later that police received 10 rupees for each neighborhood resident that they were able to motivate to undergo sterilization. So there was also this financial incentive that the police got from forcing people into vasectomy. So less than a week after this family planning camp opened in Turkmen Gate, there also was this demolition squad that came in to demolish the neighborhood, to bulldoze it for redevelopment. And then the plan was to relocate the residents to the eastern border of Delhi on the other side of the Yamuna. And so, this was also part of the strategy that Indira Gandhi had of urban redevelopment during the emergency. So this in Turkmen Gate, there was this crystallization of both the family planning, aspect of the emergency, but then also this urban redevelopment aspect. So there was this spontaneous uprising against the police that happened. And then as the Central Reserve Police Force was then called in, and as protesters who were trying to defend their neighborhood from being bulldozed began to conduct their midday prayers, then the police came in and charged with batons and tear gas, which led to this clash between police and protesters. And then in the clash, the police started shooting on the crowd and killed protesters without repercussion. It was later revealed that it was Sanjay Gandhi who gave the orders to shoot on the crowds. And then there was this curfew that was enacted, and the New Delhi Public Services Department cut power supplies to the neighborhood, and then police started forcibly entering homes and removing people from their homes. And there was a lot of assaults that was happening, particularly on women in this moment of forcible removal. And then, the neighborhood was razed to the ground overnight. And so in this very short-lived uprising that ultimately failed to protect the neighborhood, many protesters were killed, hundreds were arrested. And so once the protesters from Turkmen Gate were then in jail, in Tihar jail for the most part, they were, according to the jail superintendent and later interviews, were given worse treatment in jail. They were placed in cells that were lined with asbestos, so they would be unbearably hot in the summer. And other protesters were placed in what's called the Pagal Chukki, or we can think of as a lunatic ward, is usually the English translation, as a form of psychological torture. But the torture that political prisoners faced during the emergency was not just psychological, and there were this range of pretty brutal, creative also techniques of torture against political prisoners, many of which I think we are, those who know what happens in these situations kind of know, but then there was a lot of other things that we can get into, but it's kind of dark. But I think that we forget that that there was this kind of torture that was enacted against political prisoners, because I think we have this idea that, it was some political rivals who were rounded up, hung out in jail for a while, but no. And students were also not exempt. So I will read part of this underground socialist student movement communique, where it described this one student who had been detained by the emergency, and the communique said that he was denied sleep, food and water for 2 days at a time, was beat specifically on the back of his neck, was hung upside down, had chili solution poured into his nose with a rod tied around his neck, and while in this position, his testicles were poked with a rod, and later he was made to stand for days at a stretch. So these are the kinds of things that were happening to students and other political actors during the emergency. And I think that, we do forget the fact that this was going on at the time.
No, thanks for that, Kristin. And I mean, reading your book, yeah, that was one of the things that stayed with me, that this was a very violent, you know, interregnum, and also how we think about it is that there was a severe human cost that was paid for it. One of the things that again that also stood out for me, and I'm glad that you mentioned the Turkmen Gate uprising, was that the Delhi as a city was remade. Like, how we think of Delhi as an urban space was significantly altered by the experience of emergency. And obviously we'll get into talking about the coffee house particularly. But how do you think the memory of emergency lives on in the city in terms of how we experience it spatially?
Yeah, I think that that's a really excellent question. And I think that, there is sort of like all of these erasures that happened because of the emergency. And so, as you mentioned, there's the tragedy of Turkmen Gate and, the death toll that took place as part of that uprising. But then there's also sort of like the generation that was never born because of forced sterilization. And then there's also sort of like the way in which the emergency reshaped Delhi through the demolitions that took place. So there are all these like multiple erasures that are happening across, particularly in the city of Delhi, but like across North India. And so one of the things that it made me think of is, in Intizar Hussein's like novel about Delhi, he wrote that, I'm amazed at how many times in its centuries-long journey, Delhi has been like plundered and resettled. And so if we think about the city of Delhi in like the longue durée, that it's this place that sort of like witnessed all of these different rise and falls of empire, and of different political rulers. And so each time we see that this new Delhi is made in the midst of the old Delhi. And the other like Intizar Hussain quote that I really like about this is that each leader of this new Delhi will claims that, in Intizar Hussein's words, this Delhi will have such vigor and brilliance that all the preceding Delhis and the Delhis to follow will fade before it. But we also know that none of these cities was loyal to its maker, and everyone who tried to build an empire on the city of Delhi would lose it. And so progressive writer Ahmed Ali also expressed a similar sentiment when he wrote, 7 Delhis have fallen, the 8th has gone the way of its predecessors, yet to be demolished and built again. Life, like the phoenix, must collect the spices for its nest, set fire to it, and arise resurrected out of the flame. So I think that we can think about the emergency as yet this other Delhi that was built by Indira Gandhi, and then just, within the span of a few years, another fallen Delhi. And so, when we think about the way that it's affecting the landscape of the city, we see like just kind of in going around Delhi, there's all of these sort of like ruin that's in clear view of new construction. And I think that that's something really striking that a lot of people who are studying urban Delhi like point out, that there's sort of like the old and the new, and a lot of it is uncommemorated. And this kind of echoes against the architecture of everyday life in the city. And so, as you mentioned, urban development and demolition drives were really central to Indira Gandhi's economic development strategies. And there's a lot of evidence that the Gandhi family also personally benefited from the demolitions and urban redevelopment programs during the emergency. But one such erasure that we can talk about is the loss of the original location of the Connaught Place Indian Coffee House, which was demolished by the New Delhi Municipal Corporation in '76 at the behest of Sanjay Gandhi. So one of the erasure of this is sort of, so for those of you who know Delhi, it was on what's now a public park above Palika Bazaar.
The Central Park, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So that's where the old Indian coffee house used to be before it was demolished. And so one of the more powerful moments in one of the interviews that I did with a socialist leader was telling me how he was in the back of a police jeep and going from Tihar jail to the courthouse for trial. And he saw that it was just reduced to rubble. And he told me that his reaction was just to start like weeping in the back of the police jeep to see the loss of the space that was so important to him. And, he told me this was the only place that my friends and I used to go. Like, this was where we would meet our people. It was so shocking. And everyone was like really shocked. And there was this feeling that the demolition of this coffee house was like the demolition of their house. And so it was interesting that a lot of people in trying to talk and recount that, like there was this like a well of emotion that came up. so everyone sort of like, whether, particularly on the left, whether in the various communist parties, socialists, Maoists, like felt very personally affected by the loss of this space. And of course, this is not commemorated at this point. I mean, like, we don't know that this was, like, if you walk around the Central Park in CP, like, there's no indication that this was this central node of the resistance against the emergency. You know, there's also sort of like the shady back dealings between Sanjay Gandhi and the NDMC that led this to happen, which were, you know, ruled, you know, a violation of Delhi's master plan land use. So it wasn't really a legal demolition. But when I asked, particularly the leftists who felt so attached to the space, you know, like, why did this happen, or how did this happen? You know, a lot of people were like, well, it was obvious that Sanjay Gandhi and his mother were just threatened by this coffee house. So for example, the JNU student movement leader and former MP DP Tripathi told me, like, everybody knows this, Sanjay Gandhi was angry because people were meeting in the coffee house, so he just ordered it demolished. And so I think that, you know, this is one of the things where doing this research is really difficult, because there are sort of the NDMC reports that show that there were some, like, you know, different kinds of code violations, but those were then proved to be trumped up by Sanjay Gandhi. And then there's sort of this supposition that a lot of the left had, that this cafe was a threat. And then the newspapers were just sort of like celebrating, you know, Sanjay Gandhi's brilliance and, you know, constructing all these new urban development projects and focusing on how Halika Bazaar was going to be this like market of the future. And so neither of these sources really tell the full story, but I think that when we put them together, we see that, you know, they all contain like some aspect of truth, you know, in that, on the one hand, we see that like there probably was this very real threat about the organization that was taking place in the coffee house. You know, there was, you know, a way in which the Gandhis benefited from these new urban development projects, and there was this redistribution and redevelopment of the land. And I think that it was a way to sort of like profit and then also like put an end to the kind of oppositional voices that were gathering in this cafe. So that, I think, is just one example of how the city of Delhi was fundamentally remade, or the architecture of the city was remade in this moment of the emergency.
Yeah, thanks for that question. Actually, we have a few photos of the coffee house, and which I'd like to share if technology holds up and I'm able to operate it properly. Okay, let's give this a shot. Yeah, so, you know, you were speaking about the threat, and the only threat that I have in my time but the Indian coffee house that I have recognized is a monkey. Because and good luck eating any of your omelets or drinking your coffee in peace there, because this is what happens. I mean, there's a bunch of monkeys there, and who can yeah, who can terrorize you on any day. But why we have this selection of photos is to give everyone a sense of the site as it looks today, or how it looked anywhere until a few years ago. Obviously, I mean, you could make the case that all of these tables are socially distant, so maybe they can still be in operation. Moving on, this is a photo actually clicked by Kristin of a monkey drinking water. Perhaps it was a hot day, and this is how, but this is how you sort of popularly remembered this cafe. But one of the next photo that I do want to move on to, so this is the crossing in center of Delhi, and I think once you walk down from its old previous location, which was the Central Park, you get to this crossing, and then like you can see, if I zoom in, it says here in this is a slightly blurred image, so apologies for that, but like it says there, it's the Indian Coffee House, and then you approach the stairs, and it's on the second floor in this place called Mohan Singh Place, which is this building where you can actually, which used to be really popular at one time to get fabric, and especially for if you wanted to get your jeans stitched, a lot of people would go there. It's not, I mean, it has seen better days, let's just say that. But one of the things that I do want to ask you, Kristin, about the space particularly is a couple of photos, obviously, and there's indoor seating as well, is the question of coffee itself. How's the coffee there?
Well, the coffee isn't great. And I think that it has at this point a reputation for being more about the conversation than about the coffee.
Right. So the focus has to be like you were saying earlier on the resistance as opposed to the brewing. But moving on to the organization and how you talking. If you could just talking about the history of the coffee house as it is organized, and if you could tell us about this photo and in the workers who are there, and this obviously gives us a glimpse of the people who work there. What was it about the coffee house? Why did it become this space? And was it associated with a certain kind of politics? How would you describe it? Yeah.
Yeah, so this last photo is of the workers' locker room. So this is where like everyone changes clothes into their uniform. So you can see everyone's street clothes hanging there. But yeah, so I mean, in one Indian coffee house worker's memoirs, Nadakal Parmeshwaran Pillai, who worked at the Trishur location of Indian Coffee House, said that Indian Coffee House found its place in history through its martyrdom at the hands of Sanjay Gandhi during the emergency. And so the New Delhi location has always been the crown jewel in the Indian coffee house chain, because the coffee house, as Pillai puts it in his memoirs, started with humble origins, and then the workers collectively owned this building in the heart of Delhi that was a central meeting place for ministers and bureaucrats and intellectuals and artists and political activists. So it really begs the question of, so what were these origins, and how did it come to be this, such an important place in Indian history? So the coffee house was founded in 1936, and this was in the context of an empire-wide commodity export surplus crisis. And so South Indian plantation owners created this cafe chain, and it was called Coffee House in the pre-independence times, to create a domestic demand for coffee in order to weather this commodity export surplus crisis that was happening across the British Empire. And so the coffee house was overseen by the British Coffee Board of India until 1946, when then workers' unrest began with the publication of this pamphlet called Coffee House Laborers Are Also Human Beings. And this was written by some Communist Party of India Undivided affiliated workers in one of the locations in what was then Travancore and now Kerala. So soon after the circulation of the pamphlet, the coffee houses then were occupied by the workers one by one, and they renamed it Indian Coffee House. And so this renaming of the firm and the appropriation of the firm by its workers was part of this, was to emphasize that they were appropriating a British firm and its assets and reclaiming it for Indian workers. And so this then, spilled into the moment after independence, and the Indian Coffee House Workers Labor Union then became a legally recognized trade union affiliated with the CPI Undivided. The union's first task, though, was to resist the closure of the Indian Coffee House and the termination of the workers, because after independence, Nehru and the Coffee Board of India wanted to close the coffee houses that the workers had occupied in the heat of the freedom struggle. It didn't really conform to a lot of his notions of how economic development should proceed. He had this emphasis on heavy industry and didn't really see much utility in having a state-owned service sector cafe chain. Though the workers, because they were very committed to sort of this CPI line, wanted to be part of a state-owned enterprise because they thought that that would be sort of like the best way to realize the goals of an actual socialism in independent India. So A.K. Gopalan, who was the union vice president and was a Lok Sabha MP affiliated with the CPI, and then later with the CPM after the division in the parties, created this group in 1957 to try to stop the closure of the Indian Coffee House locations and to reinstate them as an official state-owned firm, just as they were under the British Raj, because that was the goal of the workers throughout the 40s and 50s, to become a state-owned firm. But the coffee board wanted to sell off the coffee houses to private ownership because, again, their focus was more on heavy industry and less on the service sector. But then at the end of June of 1957, the coffee house workers staged a hunger strike. And one worker in a memoir that I found of this period of the firm's history said, all of the freedom the union achieved in 12 years was ending. We were at a stage worse than the old stage of being the slaves of the British Coffee Board of India. We were going to become some coolie slaves of hotel capitalists. And so they made these black badges and held public demonstrations in every city where there was an Indian coffee house. And the coffee board proceeded with dismissals of the workers and closing of different locations of the coffee house. And then A.K. Gopalan had this rallying public speech where he said, you are the workers, those who have to rule the world. This is very simple for you. Dear comrades, you can take hold of the coffee house, rule it, and run it without the capitalists. So in this speech, he proposed this new strategy that the workers continue to sort of have this informal status because they were sort of like not a legally recognized firm in this whole decade after independence. And so he had this idea that the workers could appropriate the coffee houses and run them under a cooperative. And the slogan he developed to sort of, hit that home was, the coffee houses we work in belong to us. So then by August of 57, there were these sit-in strikes at different coffee house locations across India. And just as by the end of the month, the workers were preparing to go from a sit-in to a hunger strike, the union, the coffee board, and Nehru and AKG all agreed that the coffee houses could be registered as cooperative societies under the Indian Cooperative Societies Act. So there was this decade-long struggle to be a legally recognized cooperative. And so then by the 1970s, Indian coffee house had become more than just this economic intervention into capitalism and colonialism. It was a place that then, because again of the communist workers movement that created the cafe, attracted artists and intellectuals and anyone who was really engaged in left politics, and a wide range of left politics, like not just fellow communists. So the New Delhi location at Connaught Place, which we've been talking about, was described to me by like some of particularly the political actors, but also the artists who gathered there, as a place of democracy in action. Some, particularly those who had tangential relations to the hippie movement, told me about its positive vibrations, and that it was sort of glamorous, and that, it was this intellectual hub that just sort of drew you in. And so you would go there and see poets and filmmakers and artists and musicians and all kinds of creative people, but then also sort of like the left more broadly. And so when I asked people that I did oral histories with, why did they go to this place? I heard things like, well, all the political meetings of my group were there, or I just wanted to hear what the latest news was. I knew if I was bored some afternoon, I would go there and I would see all my friends. Or it was a place to discuss politics, to talk about art. It was also a place to interact with foreigners. So I think for a lot of people, they were interested in engaging with people from all over the world who would come there when they were visiting Delhi. And then there was also this aspect where, for men in particular, there was this idea that, oh, there were all these beautiful women who would hang out in the coffee house and we just want to go and look at them. That's what they told me. So a lot of people would just come there every day, and it was cheap and it was centrally located and had this really unconventional bohemian crowd. And particularly because it was a cooperative, nobody was told to get up and leave after finishing their coffee. So there were people who would come when it opened at 9 a.m. and then just stay until it closed in the evenings. And all of the workers tend to know these regulars. And even if they couldn't pay for their coffee that day, they would just run up a tab and they're like, yeah, you'll get us at the end of the month or whatever. So it was a space where that just sort of generated these kinds of conversations and this camaraderie. And I think
just one of the things that I remembered from reading your book was that different political affiliations had a different table as well, which was, I mean, I almost implicitly understood that this is, the communist table, this is the socialist table, but also right wing or say a Jansang, there was a Jansang table as well, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah, so every political party seemed to have its table, but then also artist groups. So it would be like, this is the filmmakers table, or like this is the painters table, or this is the poets table. So yeah, there was this kind of sense of, I guess, this sort of like a high school cafeteria where everybody had their regular seating.
Just one of the final things that I see that there's a lot of activity on the chat group, so I'm keen to hear everyone else's questions as well. But just one final thing that I did want to, ask you was about the very fact that the space of the coffee house brought people of different political affiliations together. And you also write about the case of prisons as well. In Tihar jail, you have this unlikely alliances being made. One of the major sort of, criticisms, or one of the things that people definitely do remember about JP is the fact that, that there was an alliance with Jansang when the movement, when the resistance was picking pace and against the emergency. How do you see those different political alliances? And it's interesting to me, these two spaces, like a coffee as this space for liberation and freedom, and the prison as this restricted space defined by restriction, and these two contrasting spaces, but they both in some ways work to bring people of different political affiliations together. And maybe if it has any lessons for organizing today, or how when you meet people who have different political ideas, and yet you may see these alliances come through.
Yeah, I think that that's a really excellent question, and it gets to one of the central, arguments in the book, that these spaces, because they brought people of a range of political viewpoints and opinions together, became really important resources for defending democracy and also for furthering different movements against authoritarian repression. And so I think that also it sort of shifts our focus. I like this dichotomy that you raise of sort of like the cafe as a space of liberation and the jail as a space of limitation or constriction. But both of them are bringing this range of the spectrum of Indian politics together in one space and forcing these conversations that get sometimes very heated. But at the end of the day, all these groups are coming back there and coming back and having the debates and the conversations. And I think that that's really unlike any place in the world in the present moment where we don't see conversations in this manner between right and left. So I think that one of the things that focus does is it shifts our attention, because I think that there's a lot of, in social science of revolution or social movement, there tends to be this thinking about regime change on a state level, when we're thinking about how these, how to create a movement that can affect change. But I think that what this focuses our attention to is these smaller urban spaces, which in the book I call an autonomous zone, that try to understand how can these urban spaces foster resistance against authoritarianism through this kind of everyday organizing, rather than sort of a revolution. So I think it shows on the small scale how there are these physical places where people can challenge dominant norms, both culturally and socially, and really envision a different future. And so what the left and the right are both doing in the spaces of the jail and in the space of the cafe are trying to work out their own ideologies. And so it reminds me of this conversation that I had with someone from Jamaat Islami, who was saying jail, we didn't really understand why we were in jail, but when we got to jail, we were meeting all these people that we weren't meeting, that we were trying to sort of meet through different kinds of political work. And so it was great for us to be able to communicate with them, what is our political party stance, what kind of utopian future do we want, and how do we want to go about enacting that. And so I think that there were these conversations between the left and the right about what would be a ideal utopian future for India. And so these kind of face-to-face meeting places, whether it's the cafe or whether it's jail, are really important to envisioning sort of an alternative ideology. So if we think about sort of what Emanuel Wallerstein identified, that in order to sort of fundamentally transform the world system, anti-systemic movements need to create a new culture, a culture of the future world, he called it, in order to animate the movement against capitalism. And so, what these movements are doing, or what these autonomous zones are doing, is exactly that, is trying to create a new way of thinking about the world by engaging all of these different political actors in this kind of chaotic way. And so it becomes this really important resource, I think, to movements against the state and capital, because it's really trying to envision a future culture that then can allow different actors to wage this sort of ideological struggle that I think is a really important basis for any kind of collective action.
Thanks so much, Kristin. I have a few more questions, but I actually now I would like to hear from everyone else as well. How would you like us to take questions, one by one, or should we take 2 or 3 at once? What would you prefer?
Best for you. I'm down.
Okay, cool. Sabika, I guess
Yeah, sure.
you've
So,
got some
guys, you can
questions.
leave your questions in the chat section or just your names, and I will start reading out these names in order in which they've been left. And we're just going to request people to unmute themselves and open their cameras if possible to ask these questions. And we're trying to keep it as flexible as possible. So if you want to be included in an ongoing discussion, just let us know. You reflect that in your comment, and we'll pump you up in the conversation. So I already see a few questions. So maybe we can begin with Srimati Roy. You had asked a question about coffee houses in other cities. Would you like to bring that up?
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, just a question because I thought that a lot of the conversation centered around Delhi and Connaught Place and so on. And I am from Calcutta myself, where coffee houses have played a very, very pivotal role in shaping, the cultural, in being considered as a cultural focal point. So, any particular role that these coffee houses would have played in the 60s and the 70s in as place where resistance brewed against the emergency or any other political system of that time?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for raising that, because I think it is important to sort of zoom out and think about the coffee houses as a chain throughout India. And I think that at the height of the firm, there were almost 425 locations across India. So it was pretty expansive. So during the emergency in particular, the coffee houses were linked up through this kind of underground network. And so particularly for activists who went underground, there was this node of Indian coffee houses that would link Delhi with Calcutta, like through UP and Bihar. And so for a lot of particularly the socialist activists who had to go underground at that time, there was this link between the cafes in let me see if I can get the order right. Allahabad, Lucknow, Patna, and then to Calcutta. And so a lot of people felt that if they would leave Delhi and head east, that there would be this less of a chance of being apprehended by the police. And so in each node of these different coffee houses, there were these, there were regulars in those cities who would then help activists who were fleeing Delhi and going underground to find shelter. But also the activists coming from Delhi would often bring pamphlets or collections of anti-emergency poetry to then share. So there was a lot of instances that I heard of where, particularly for those who made it all the way to Calcutta, that there was sort of a lot of poetry readings that would happen that were mostly sponsored by the CPM in the coffee house location in College Street of anti-emergency activists. So there was this this tight network that was happening among the cafes. And this was not just sort of like as a way to help movement leaders who had to go underground, but also a way of circulating different materials of resistance. So I think in its most extreme form, through the Railway Workers Union, there was this link between the Railway Workers Union and the Indian Coffee House Workers Union, where they were bringing bomb-making materials to the Indian Coffee House in Delhi through various different nodes of the Indian Coffee House in both Western India and North and Eastern India, in order to sort of like create some, strategic, symbolic, violent protest during Delhi during the emergency. So there's a lot of ways in which the Calcutta Coffee House was important, but also various locations throughout UP and Bihar and Gujarat as well.
Thanks, Kristin. Matthew, I believe you wanted to make a comment about the Indian Coffee House in Kerala. Do we still have you, Matthew? Okay. I guess then we'll move to Vipin Sehgal.
Hi, Kristin. Thank you very much for this wonderful talk. I can't wait to get my hands on the book. And as somebody who in the mid-60s went to the coffee houses in Delhi, Chandigarh, and Shimla religiously every evening, I must take issue with your point about conversation being better than coffee, because When now we're talking about Starbucks molded taste with cream, etc., which isn't available in India. So, I mean, coffee tastes damn good in the 60s, as far as I remember. Just one quick comment. I want to use this forum, if you will. I don't know whether you've mentioned it in your book or not, but I'd like to pay homage to the waiters at the coffee houses. Such a wonderful group of people. I'm talking mid 60s, pre credit card era, not to say that the people who went to coffee houses would even today be eligible to get a credit card in the straitened circumstances. But my regular waiters always extended me credit from their pockets. And I'm not the only one. I bet every activist, everybody who went there regularly lived on credit provided by these poor waiters. So that was the comment I wanted to make, an homage to the waiters of coffee houses.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, sorry, Kristin, go ahead.
I do wish that I could have tried the coffee in the 60s and 70s, because everybody told me that, like, that if I just don't even know what I'm missing out on. I think it's sad that we can't just go back in time and experience that.
So I believe next we have a question from Shabana Siddiqui. Would you like to read out your comment or question?
Hi, because I missed the first part of this lecture, so I want to know what is the argument of your book? Like, what are you arguing with coffee house and this emergency? Like, what are you trying to say? Thank you.
So I think that that's a really important question, obviously, and thank you for that. And so if I can sum it up in one sentence, it's that, you know, that there are these different resources that the anti-colonial workers movement in the 1940s created that then became really critically important in defending democracy when it was taken away in the 1970s. And that the left of the 70s worked together with the left of the 40s to create this, this urban space that could keep and preserve the memory of the more radical aims of national liberation alive, and that this played a really important role in the struggle against the emergency.
So next we have a comment from Samir Mahindra. Would you like to read out your comment?
Hello. First of all, I would like to thank Kristin for looking at this angle in particular, because usually what we see is that history is written in a very macro form, but there are now narratives. Particularly, we are reminded of how Shahid Amin, I think, he studied the Chauri Chaura incident in great detail and how that was instrumental in taking the Indians' freedom struggle to the next level. Then we saw recently, we have seen Strobe Talbot, a British historian who has studied how the police, the British police, how it was the role which they have played in the anti-colonial struggle. And so these kind of angles which are taken, the way Kristin has taken this coffee house as a theme to look at the contemporary history, it is really very appreciable. And the second point which I want to make is that somewhere down the line, it is nothing but a struggle of power in which there are contradictions which keep increasing manifold. One of them was mentioned by Shreyansh, I think, when he said that the different political affiliations in the coffee house, or in the general term, when the Jansangh came and merged with the Janata Party. So we saw that these different political affiliations, they merged. But more importantly, what is ignored is that many decades later, that all these people who were on different sides when it came to emergency or anti-emergency, they were also functioning together. One particular example which I highlighted in the comment was George Fernandez. So George Fernandez is an icon, he's a symbol of anti-emergency struggle. And one of the pro-emergency protagonist who was mentioned in Turkmen Gate. I think Kristin mentioned Turkmen Gate. So that was Jamhoor. So Jamhoor and George Fernandez rubbing shoulders with each other in Vajpayee's cabinet. That shows that at the end of the day, all this emergency or anti-emergency or having different tables in the coffee house, it all gets blurred. And the most recent example of this getting blurred is when Shiv Sena joins hands with the Congress party. So it's nothing but power struggle which manifests itself. And lastly, I have a small question for Kristin, that this coffee house resistance movement, was it really very strong? Did it lead or culminate in itself into having some strong results? I haven't read the book, so I won't be aware what she's mentioning about there. But George Fernandez had made a very pertinent remark that emergency was lifted by Mrs. Gandhi not because of any resistance which she was facing, and his quotable quote was that we got away very cheap. So if Mrs. Gandhi didn't want to lift emergency, she could have continued perennially as Robert Mugabe did in Zimbabwe. I'm not sure how important this coffee house related struggles were, but I'm sure that Kristin would have highlighted the importance of that in her book. Thank you.
Thanks so much for those comments and for your question. And I do think that that's really important to think about sort of what role did the coffee house play in ending the emergency or ending the rule of Indira Gandhi. And so I think that, you know, right now it's a difficult situation with the archives and records because that's still censored. And it doesn't seem like any time in the future we are going to have access to exactly what happened behind closed doors when Indira Gandhi decided to hold elections. It seems to be the case that her advisors believed that she would win in elections. And I think that there was a lot of pressure, both from her friends, Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, to reinstate elections because she was really worried in a lot of reports that I've read of being seen as a dictator by the international community. So I think that there are a lot of factors that we might be able to hypothesize about, but I don't think there's no way that we can really know for sure at this point until those records are accessible. But I think that one of the things that the coffee house did in bringing particularly the left and the right opposition movements together, both on the level of political party leaders initially, and then in jail when everyone was arrested. But the students, particularly who were left outside of jail, used the Indian coffee house to unite both the right and left student movements against the emergency and the JNU and DU student movements against the emergency. And so this was a really important node where different opposition groups and different groups that necessarily maybe don't have readily apparent commonalities were meeting together and really strategizing about what to do. And so I think that there's a way in which sort of the ideological basis of the Janata Party wouldn't have been able to hold had it not been for these kinds of really dense social ties that came out of the experiences of right and left leaders, both in the cafe, in campuses to some extent, and also in the jails. So I think that we can say that the Indian Coffee House brought these different groups together. And without, I think, this left-right coalition, you wouldn't have had the Janata Party success during elections. And it would have, it could have been that as Indira Gandhi's echo chamber was telling her that it could have been possible that she would have won elections in '77 had it not been for this left-right coalition against her.
So now we have a question from SV. I think you've already typed your question. Would you like to read it aloud?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for having this event. I haven't gotten a chance to read the book yet. I came here from reading the article at Jamhoor. And I think you already kind of answered this in your previous answer, but I would love for you to speak on the age and the background of these coffee house patrons. There's a long history of student activists and particularly college campuses being the epicenter of dissent. So could you speak a little bit more about the background of these attendees?
Yeah, I think that that's an excellent question. So thank you for that. There was this sense where you know, was really important for the student movement, the coffee house, and it did attract a lot of young people, but it also attracted a lot of people across the generations. And so one of the really interesting things that I think came out of the interviews is that a lot of young students, whether in high school or in university, were going to the coffee house and then meeting some of really eminent political leaders like Chandrasekhar, who was really important during India's independence movement, were still alive and frequenting the coffee house. So for a lot of the particularly younger student movement leaders, there were these conversations that were happening between much older political leaders and then sort of like the burgeoning generation of student movement leaders in both universities and high schools. And so this was a space that attracted people of all ages and facilitated conversations across the generation. So I think that that's a really important point to bring out. And I think that that's something to note. But there also was this sense that, particularly in the 60s and 70s, that it was young, because it was like sort of a bohemian place that attracted sort of foreigners who were coming to India as part of the hippie movement. And so there was this sense that it wasn't like a stuffy, stodgy place, even though it had people of all ages. It was also a place that was sort of like, you know, oriented towards a youth culture, even if it attracted people of all ages.
So I have a question from Harshita, and I'm going to read it aloud. And her question is that, Kristin, could you talk a little more about what were the collaborations between the coffee house union workers? And like they had connections with the railway workers, but were there any other trade unions that they were in collaboration with?
Yeah. So I think that that's a great question. And I think that this gets all linked up through the different party affiliations. So they were initially, before the split in the parties, CPI undivided, and then went with the CPM after the split. So there was this sense where they were like had these ties and connections naturally to other CPM affiliated unions. And then there is, I think, this interesting tension that comes in the emergency where most of the patrons and the most, like, I guess, vocal patrons of the coffee house are Socialist Party members. So then there was this affinity between the Socialist Party and the Indian Coffee House Workers Union. Even though it traversed this party line that was very contentious. And I think that a lot of particularly the socialists I spoke with, had a lot of animosity for the communists, but would say, but you know, AKG is okay, he's an exception. So that's how we could get along with you know, the Indian Coffee House Workers Union, even though they're CPM, but they, you know, AKG was somebody who was beloved across left party lines. So I think that a lot of this collaboration was cemented also through the patrons, which I think is important to note, because there were people from all different political persuasions who were coming to the coffee house and obviously interacting with the coffee house workers in this really real way. And there were just like stories of coffee house workers getting involved in conversations, although there was sort of like this class divide in a lot of instances. So I do think that that's important to bring out, and that through this kind of close relationships that were formed through the regulars, but in particular, there was this way in which collaboration was able to traverse you know, party lines among the left in particular, which are still very heated today.
Divyani, do you want to go ahead with your question?
Hi, am I audible? Yeah, okay, cool. Thank you so much, Kristin. This has been wonderful so far. I just had a quick question. So I was wondering, between 1940s and 1975 or 1970s, is the Delhi coffee house, like the Indian coffee house in Delhi, or just the entire chain, are they still autonomous zones? Like what are they functioning as between this period? Because you've discussed at length, you've even explained, like you've given a definition of how you see these autonomous zones, right? So I was just curious about what's happening in between. And then you also briefly mentioned about the JNU resistance and reaction to the emergency, right? So I was also wondering if there's a difference between the Indian coffee house as an autonomous zone and the JNU space at the JNU campus is one. And then what would that interaction or difference look like? That's it. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much for those questions. So I think that is really important to think about this period of the 40s to the 70s, which I know I glossed over in my introduction to the book. And so this is a sense, I think, the way at least I see it is that the coffee house is shifting meanings from particularly this space that's mostly geared towards its relationship to the labor movement as an intervention and a reaction to this nexus of colonialism and capitalism. And after the, independence, when it becomes this informal worker cooperative and then legally recognized worker cooperative in 57, it's a space that starts to attract a lot of left intellectuals. So, particularly I think for the socialists, Ram Manohar Loya starts becoming a regular there. JP, when he's in Delhi, frequents the coffee house. So it becomes this space that attracts a lot of important figures among the broadly speaking left, and develops this character slowly over time as being this space of creative, bohemian, leftist regulars. So that starts to, I think, attract a certain type of crowd in over this period that then, is heightened like in the late 50s into the 60s. And then by the 70s, I think really explodes in this moment of authoritarian repression. And there are a lot of really strong links between JNU and the coffee house of the 70s. And so, it was a space like on campus in particular, there is this sense that, especially in that period, it was really dominated by the left. So there weren't a lot of spaces for the center and right in the JNU campus at that time. And so one of the ways in which the JNU left was able to meet people who are more in the center and right is through this exchange in the cafe, because that really wasn't happening, at least that I could tell, on campus at that period. And then I think the other thing that is a big, like one of the things that came up that might be of interest is sort of like that was also a place where JNU students would go on dates. And I think that that's detailed in the article that I wrote for Jamhoor a couple months ago now, that on campus there was still kind of a sense of, gendered separation, but that through that one of the places where men and women could interact and with a more romantic tenor was in the cafe. So there were reasons that students from JNU would make the trip to CP to go to the coffee house, and mostly for these different kind of dialogues, also with DU leaders. So that it was kind of a, not exactly halfway, but it was a place to also coordinate with the DU student movement. So this was sort of a hub that widened the JNU conversations, I would say. But that's a great question.
Thanks, Kristin. Shazeb, you're next in line to ask your question.
Thank you. Thank you, Kristin, for that great talk. And I've read your introduction for your book and some of your articles, all of your articles for Jamhoor. So I had a question about kind of the terms authoritarianism and bourgeois democracy or liberal democracy that you use. And kind of from this talk and from what I read from the introduction, and maybe you clarify this further on in the book, which I haven't read in its entirety, but you kind of make a distinction between the two and kind of suggest that authoritarianism and the emergency was kind of a break from liberal democracy, rather than seeing these forms of authoritarianism and these forms of suspension of law as always integral to the reproduction of liberal democracy. The only difference now in the emergency being that maybe the people affected by it was on a much larger scale, whereas before it was in Kashmir, it was maybe in tribal areas of India. So I'm curious as to why you want to hold on to this distinction of authoritarianism versus liberal democracy, rather than saying that actually liberal democracy in its very nature is always reproduced by the suspension of law among certain populations, among certain people.
Yeah. No, I think you're absolutely right in that distinction. And, and I think that that's a really good corrective. So in terms of the larger theoretical argument that I'd like to make, which maybe is, I don't know, so I guess what I want to say on that point is that, the way that I see it is that is this authoritarian repression is the foundation of sort of liberal modernity, right? And I think that that's something that we know because in these moments where there are more demands for political action or for like redistributive justice or for, you know, a more radical revolutionary politics, that's when we see these moments of state repression. But you know, these states of emergency and states of repression are definitely not the exceptional situation. This is the foundation, and there are moments in which this becomes apparent and is revealed to larger swaths of the population, as you point out. And so I definitely don't want to give the impression that you know, that there's these moments of that generally we have like a liberal democracy and that's great, and then there are these moments where it tips into authoritarian repression. I do see that as sort of like this underlying foundation, but I think that when we think about it primarily through this ideological lens, and that's what I'm trying to do on some level in the book, about like how we construct ideologies that aid and fuel revolutionary movements. And I think that in those moments, there has to be this real reconciling in a very serious way with the question of liberal democracy and bourgeois democracy and what it means. Because I do think that one of the missteps, particularly by the Maoists who were opposed to the emergency, is that they really struggled in reading that moment as something to push back against. And there were real human consequences of the emergency that were different from, you know, before the emergency was declared. And I think that Maoists were like, this was the state anyway, this is going to be the state. You know, why should we, you know, ally with particularly like more conservative groups that don't share our interests, when we always knew that there was this repressive state. I mean, I know that one Maoist I spoke with told me, you know, we were getting shot in our beds before the emergency, we were getting shot in our beds during the emergency, what was the difference? But I do think that there is a way in which, like, particularly some Maoists rethought the way that the movement thought about the state, to the benefit, I think, of the Maoist movement in India, and particularly allowed it to become a real vibrant attraction to a lot of students after the emergency, because of this rethinking of what authoritarian repression meant for everyday life and how it changed the everyday life of different groups of people. But I think that this is something that could be debated and would be really exciting to debate, for sure.
So I think I'm just going to, Matthew just sent something, so I'm going to just read it aloud. Matthew, would you like me to do that? I'm just going to assume that you do. So he says that Indian coffee house is often projected as a poster boy for the leftist ideologies. But over the years, I guess the ICH became part of history in other parts of India more than continuing its legacy. In Kerala, though, like communism, the charm and popularity of ICH still remains intact because it was a revolutionary idea of workers owning their businesses. And it was started by AKG, who is considered as a very respected leader in Kerala across political affiliations. One feature of ICH is there no difference between poor or rich or any class differentiation. There are no AC section with a normal restaurant intended to cater premium customers as seen in some other local restaurants. So Kristin, do you want to pick up any of these class questions which Matthew brings forward?
Yeah, no, I think that that's a really, insightful comment. And also to think about ways to think about ICH in the contemporary period. Yeah, I do think some places have AC parts, and particularly in Kerala, I noticed that there were a lot of locations that had AC rooms, but in Delhi, I think it's still, non-AC, as you can see from the monkey drinking off the runoff from the cooler. But I think that there is this point at which now there is this way in which, I mean, the Indian coffee house has been around since 1936, so that's a really long time. So I do think that there is this way in which it is a nostalgic space in some sense, and not seen as a live space for social movement and political discussions. And so I think that nowadays, a lot of the people who gravitate there are going there out of a nostalgia for what it once was in the past. And not so much, a place where student movements are being plotted and organized. So I think that that's a really good point. Yeah, and then there's the climate change piece. Yeah. So thanks for that comment.
So Priyansh, I believe you had some more questions that you want to touch upon.
Yeah, I am really enjoying this.
I'm really sorry. Yeah. Before you finish, so right now Priyansh is the last one on the question list. So if anybody else has any comments or questions, please feel free to send your names in.
Yeah, I'm really enjoying the discussion, but one of the things that came up for me, and I wanted Kristin to maybe speak in detail about it, is that this term has come up quite a few times now, of autonomous zones. And how are we to think of autonomy, and whose autonomy, and autonomous from whom? And I was wondering whether there are, you can think of any recent examples, and maybe in an Indian context, can we think of, say, Shaheen Bagh as an autonomous zone, or is Tahrir Square an autonomous zone? I'm keen to understand what the term implies, and if there are any examples of it.
Yeah. No, I think that that's a really important question, and it brings us into sort of how we can levy these concepts for social movement strategy, which I think is really important. So I think Shaheen Bagh is a really good example that's worth thinking through. And I think that it is a place in which we see at least the center and the left come together, because there were some, Congress politicians who were coming to give speeches at the height of the movement activity. And I think that there was this way in which it was accessible to like a wide range of people, but it's also like in a place that's not so centrally located and generally accessible within the city of Delhi. So I think that, unlike Connaught Place, which is sort of like the center of Delhi, and a place where people could just wander in, Shaheen Bagh is a little bit more remote and difficult to get to certainly by auto. I mean, I like that area. It's a lot of times autos won't take you there, but or at least they wouldn't when I was living in Delhi. But, and I think that there are also a lot of commentators who think of the current student movement and JNU, and particularly sort of the conversations that were happening from 2016 on. And I think that there's some extent to which, yes, we can look to Shaheen Bagh, we can look to the left student movement and JNU, and the coalitions, particularly like the United Left Alliance, I think is really an exciting strategy to kind of keep the Hindu right out of JNU student politics. But I think that there is this way in which today we're not having the same left-right conversations that were happening in the 70s and other places. And so I think that that's to the detriment of the larger political struggle that really does, I think in this moment, the objective is to get authoritarians out of political spaces, out of office. And I think that there's work that can be done in this more the level of the urban space, but then there's also the implications for the broader and larger struggle to try to defend like a political environment that's also not attacking like particularly the groups that these far-right authoritarians see as not able to be integrated into the political system. So I think that there is sort of like in the current moment this real need to take up the pragmatic concern of the moment, and that is to push back against authoritarianism across the globe. And we're seeing this, as you mentioned, like with the revolutions across the Arab world and Egypt with Tahrir Square, and cafe culture also played a really important part in the Egyptian revolution. And then we also see, like, I think if you can think about the student movements in Belarus right now against authoritarian rule, the way students in Nigeria are pushing back against the police forces, and then in the United States with Black Lives Matter movements, that there are these ways in which like the student movement is pushing back against this far-right nationalism and authoritarianism. And part of, I think, the lessons that India's emergency can offer is that there are these different urban resources that can bring different groups together to create a strategy that really can affect change on a broader scale that maybe one particular group can't do on its own. So I think it's something that we should think about and talk through, and but it's also, I think, a really important concern for the moment.
Reba, would you like to go next with your question?
Hi, thanks. Thanks, Kristin. This has been a great conversation. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the sterilizations and, what was the sort of wider goal of that program? Was it part of a eugenics strategy of some sort? Who was targeted, and why? And what were they trying to ultimately achieve politically from that program?
Yeah, no, I think that that's a really great and important question that not only tells us a lot about the political economy of Indira Gandhi and her administration, but I think also links up to developmentalism across the globe in the 60s and 70s. So in a lot of the policy reports and briefs that I read, the stated rationale for the sterilization drive was through this kind of Malthusian logic where Indira Gandhi, instead of trying to sort of like, I guess the Green Revolution was already starting to see its limits by the late 1970s. And so there was this sort of skepticism that there would be a way through increased agrarian technologies to sustain the amount of people that were, occupying rural areas in India. And so Indira Gandhi's like rethinking of that logic was like, well, if the land could support fewer people, then people could have a better peasants could have a better livelihood. And so initially I think the family planning program started as a way to reduce the rural population in order to provide like a higher quality of living for the average agrarian resident. And the family planning policy was supported through USAID and also through a lot of Scandinavian governments, because at the time there was a lot of Scandinavian foreign aid that was being given across the global south for tubectomy and vasectomy. So I think the initial family planning centers that were opened in the late 60s were done so by the Danish government. And the other thing that links up to this is that Indira Gandhi was the first Indian prime minister to make an agreement with the World Bank. And this part of the World Bank and USAID funding that she procured was then went into the sterilization drive. So I think that like the intent of the program was out of, again, this Malthusian logic to reduce the peasant population in India. But then during the emergency, and particularly the way that Sanjay Gandhi gets like extremely fervent about taking this up, and he's coming at it, he's a little bit more to the right of his mother and has this virulent anti-communism where Indira Gandhi is kind of, a little bit more neutral about like persecuting communists. And so, I think that when the family planning program goes into the hands of Sanjay Gandhi, he starts putting all of these different incentives and metrics on state and then local officials to recruit people for family planning. And so in order to not just sort of like, advance in careers, but also to keep their jobs, a lot of family planning officials and then sort of other government officials who are roped into these schemes are targeting society's most vulnerable. And so I think that because of the way, Muslims and Dalits in particular have always been marginalized within like the Indian social and political spectrum, they were just easy targets, at least the way that I read it. But maybe somebody else has like a different take on that. But there was this sense in these documents too that was those were the groups that were being targeted. And I think that there wasn't really anything done about that on the federal level. And so we can, I think, read into a lot of what that means and why. But that's, I guess, just my interpretation. But I think that that is a really important question to ask about this period of Indian history.
So I think this actually brings us to the end of our Q&A session. And Priyansha, I'm now going to hand it over to you, and you and Kristin can
I wanted to ask, thanks, Savika. I wanted to ask Kristin a couple of things. At the top of today's event, Savika mentioned that your next work is on the Park Tea House. If you could tell us a little about that, it would be great to know. And if you see any overlaps as well in terms of brewing resistance.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, I like to joke that now I'm shifting my research focus to the other side of the Punjab, from Delhi to Lahore. And one of the reasons that I became interested in this next project is because there were a couple Indian coffee house locations that after partition ended up being on sort of the Pakistani side of the border. So there was one in Karachi, which then went out of business pretty soon after partition. And then a coffee house in Lahore that, lasted for several decades after partition. And so I became interested then in the analogs between the cafe culture in Lahore and the cafe culture in Delhi during the 70s, because there were these similar moments of increased authoritarianism in both India and Pakistan at the time. And so to try to understand like what was going on in both of these spaces, given that there were some commonalities, but also really important differences. So the next project, which is sort of like in preliminary stages, is focusing more on the artistic movements that are coming out of the Pakti House during the Zia coup, focusing mostly on poets and painters and their connection to both communist and Maoist movements, and how they were, through their creative expressions, creating a resistance movement against the Zia coup.
Thanks, Kristin. And another thing, I think it came up in a few questions as well, and I've really enjoyed reading Brewing Resistance. So first of all, congratulations on such a fine book. But if people are looking to buy it, where can they get the book?
Yeah, so it's a little difficult with the pandemic. They haven't been printing a lot of copies without risking, obviously, the safety of those who are working at the printers. So I think the best way to get the book is through Cambridge Core online, and it's free if you have university access, and or if you know maybe somebody with university access. And if you're in India, there are, I think, more copies available in that context. And I think the hardcover is 850 rupees. So that's, they can seek that out. And there will be a paperback edition coming soon that is much cheaper. So if the price point is a little too high for you, I would wait for the paperback. And if you have any specific questions about how to get the copies, particularly if whether you're in North America or in South Asia, you can always just email me and I can help direct you to a place where you can get the book. So thanks for that.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you so much, Kristin, today for taking out the time today and talk about your book and all things emergency. I would really recommend that of everyone who came out today to read the book, and it'd be great to hear your thoughts, and also check out the couple of pieces that Kristin has contributed to Jamhoor. The links were in the chat box. I'm also very grateful to Sabika and other members of Jamhoor for organizing the book launch today. And like Sabika mentioned at the beginning, Jamhoor is a volunteer-run media collective for the left in South Asia and across the South Asian diaspora. So if you like today's event, and if you like, as I would say, we all came here to discuss the resistance, but we stayed for the cute animal content that we got as a bonus. So, and if you would like more of that, I would really urge you to support what we do, and please do contribute to our Patreon. The link, Sabika, I guess is going to share the link in the chat box. And I would also encourage you, to check out our website, jamhoor.org. We recently, as I said, carried 2 articles by Kristin. If you'd like to read more about the emergency, but one of my favorites was the piece on love and politics, which was published back in June. And, as Sabika discussed earlier, we recently wrapped up our annual special issue on climate change, and you can access all the articles on the website. We will continue to publish more content and push a left perspective on issues of the day, in addition to hosting events like the book launch today. But of course, we are living through a pandemic, and every little bit of support helps along the way. So please do consider supporting Jamhoor financially, whatever little or huge amount you can afford. It'd be great, because I think, as we understand, and this is not unique to the moment, but still it's important to offer an ideological perspective to the challenges that we are facing today. And at Jamhoor, we definitely make no bones about the fact that we, offer a left perspective. So on that note, a big thank you to everyone who could make it today. And thanks again to Kristin for helping all of us learn a little more about the emergency in India. And from wherever in the world you attended today's event, I really hope you're taking good care of yourself and staying safe. So on that note, goodbye. Unless we have anything else to add, I guess we're good. Okay, goodbye everyone, take care.
Thank you all, bye-bye.
Bye.